June 1944. Over the Philippine Sea. The morning sun cut through bands of silver cloud, glinting off thousands of miles of empty ocean. Below, the vast Imperial Japanese Navy steamed east, a desperate fleet sent to halt the American advance. Above, hundreds of Zero fighters formed shimmering arcs across the blue. For Japan's young pilots, many barely out of flight school, this was their moment to prove that the Empire still ruled the Pacific skies. Engines roared in synchrony as the signal flare rose. The pilots looked down at their own reflections on polished canopies, nervous hands tightening on controls, sweat dripping under flight helmets. They had trained for months to die with honor if needed. What they didn't know was that they were flying into a storm unlike anything their predecessors had faced in 1941. Far beyond the horizon, American carriers prepared for the counterblow. Their decks were alive with motion, crews arming Hellcats, Avengers, and Dauntless bombers, guided by calm, precise orders relayed through a web of radio coordination that Japan could no longer match. When the command came, launch the strike. Now the U.S. Navy unleashed nearly 900 aircraft in disciplined waves. What unfolded over the next 2 days would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a slaughter in the sky so one-sided that Japanese veterans would remember it as the moment they realized the war had turned irrevocably against them. Their skill, bravery, and sacrifice met an enemy that had already evolved beyond them. Faster planes, better training, radar control, and endless reserves of fuel and men. By the time the last Japanese fighters limped back to their carriers, the sun was setting red over a sea filled with smoke and drifting parachutes. The Empire's best pilots were gone, and with them, Japan's hope of ever regaining control of the air. The story of Japan's loss of the skies did not begin in 1944. It began years earlier, in a period of triumph, when Japanese pilots seemed unstoppable, and their aircraft symbolized precision, courage, and dominance. The rising empire and its wings in the early 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army had developed one of the most advanced aviation programs in Asia. Their doctrine fused traditional martial discipline with Western engineering, borrowed from Britain and Germany. The Navy's pride, the Mitsubishi A6M0, embodied that philosophy, lightweight, long-ranged, and agile. When the Zero first appeared over China in 1940, few could challenge it. It could outturn, outclimb, and outfight almost any opponent. To the world, the Zero was a symbol of Japan's technological edge and pilot skill. To American observers in 1941, it was a mystery. Its range and maneuverability seemed impossible for a carrier-based fighter. When the Pacific War erupted with the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Japan's airmen carried a sense of destiny. In 6 months, they swept across the Pacific, from the Philippines to Malaya, from the Dutch East Indies to the Solomon Islands. Japanese naval aviation had humbled Western fleets that once dominated Asia. Their doctrine emphasized offense, surprise, and pilot initiative, ideals rooted in the Bushido spirit. But within that brilliance lay the seeds of disaster. The fatal design philosophy, the Zero's dominance, depended on trade-offs. Its airframe was light because it lacked armor. Its fuel tanks were unprotected. Its pilots, often among the most experienced in the world, compensated for those weaknesses with unmatched maneuverability. But those veterans were irreplaceable, the product of long, rigorous pre-war training that took years for each graduate. By 1942, those veterans were dying faster than Japan could replace them. The U.S. Navy, meanwhile, was building a new generation of pilots through an industrialized training pipeline. Each month, hundreds of cadets were graduating from American flight schools, supported by standardized manuals, simulators, and mass-produced aircraft. Japan still relied on an elitist system, small, selective, and traditional. Training remained long and ritualized. In a modern war of attrition, that became a fatal weakness. The strategic overstretch after the victories of 1941-1942, Japan found itself overstretched. The empire now spanned thousands of miles, from Burma to the Marshall Islands. Each island required garrisons, fuel, and supplies. Each airbase needed mechanics and spare parts. Japanese industry, constrained by limited raw materials and constant bombing, could not sustain the expansion. When the tide began to turn, first at Coral Sea, then decisively at Midway in June 1942, the Japanese naval air arm suffered irreplaceable losses. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, were destroyed. With them perished hundreds of elite pilots. The U.S., though badly wounded, could rebuild. Japan could not. From that moment, the two nations diverged in ways that would decide the future of aerial warfare. The Americans adapted, mechanized, and multiplied. The Japanese clung to the notion that spirit could overcome numbers. Industrial momentum. Between 1942 and 1944, U.S. industrial power reached heights that defied belief. Factories in California, Michigan, and Texas produced thousands of aircraft monthly. Fighters like the Grumman F-6F Hellcat and Vought F-4U Corsair, bombers like the Avenger and B-24 Liberator. In 1943 alone, the U.S. built over 85,000 planes, more than Japan's total production during the entire war. Each American aircraft carried radar, armored cockpits, self-sealing tanks, and heavy firepower. The Japanese could only respond with incremental improvements. The Zero evolved into variants like the A6M5, but its lightweight design philosophy limited major changes. Japan's heavier successors, like the N1K Shiden or Kai-84 Hayate, arrived too late and in too few numbers. Even fuel became a quiet enemy. Japan's aviation gasoline was inferior and scarce. Synthetic fuel production never matched the quality of American high-octane fuel, reducing engine performance. Every sortie drained reserves that could not be replaced. The shifting balance of training and tactics in 1941, Japan's carrier pilots were the best in the world, disciplined, aggressive, and precise. Their tactics emphasized close-in dogfighting and coordinated group maneuvers. But as the war progressed, those methods became outdated. American pilots learned from hard experience. They avoided turning contests with the nimble Zeros, preferring energy fighting, diving attacks from altitude, using superior speed and firepower. They used teamwork, radios, and radar direction to control engagements. The Americans didn't need individual brilliance. They built systematic dominance. Japan's reliance on intuition and personal skill, once its strength, became its downfall against this new, data-driven warfare. Signals of decline. By 1943, cracks were everywhere. In the Solomons, Japanese pilots struggled to defend supply routes under constant Allied pressure. In New Guinea, the attrition of skilled flyers forced the Navy to rush cadets into combat with barely 100 flight hours. Mechanics lacked spare engines. Ground crews scavenged parts from wrecked planes. Every month, fewer aircraft returned from missions. Veterans described squadrons of fresh faces, boys of 18 or 19, being sent out against veteran American pilots flying radar-guided Hellcats. The once proud discipline of the Imperial Navy Air Service was giving way to chaos and improvisation. The shift was psychological, too. Where once Japanese pilots had felt like hunters, by 1944 many felt like prey. A war of systems behind the courage of every American pilot stood a system. Logistics officers, radar operators, meteorologists, and engineers. Carrier task forces communicated in real time through encrypted radio networks, while Japanese fleets still relied on flag signals and line-of-sight coordination. American aircraft carriers functioned as moving factories, planes repaired, refueled, and rearmed in minutes. Japan's carriers lacked the same level of mechanization. Even deck-handling equipment lagged behind. This war was no longer about skill alone. It was about the machinery of organization. By early 1944, as U.S. forces captured the Marshall Islands and pushed toward the Marianas, Japanese command knew what was coming, an inevitable confrontation for the heart of their Pacific defense line. Tokyo called it Operation Ago, a final, decisive battle that would determine the fate of the empire. But in truth, the outcome had already been decided, not by will or courage, but by arithmetic, planes, pilots, fuel, factories. The Japanese high command was gambling with pieces it could no longer replace. And as the Imperial Navy prepared for its last great stand over the Philippine Sea, its airmen carried into battle not just their Zero fighters, but the weight of a dying system. By early 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm was fighting a war its leaders barely understood anymore. They still believed in decisive battle, A single grand confrontation that would crush American morale and restore the empire's initiative. But the world of 1944 was no longer that of 1941. The tools, tempo, and tactics of air war had evolved beyond their reach. Leadership in denial at the top of Japan's naval air hierarchy stood men forged in an earlier era. Admirals like Chisaburo Ozawa and Minichi Koga had witnessed the age of battleships and still viewed aircraft as extensions of fleet maneuver, not independent strategic weapons. They believed in courage, formation discipline, and the mystique of the ace pilot. But Japan's new air leaders lacked what the Americans had in abundance: data. U.S. commanders operated on constant intelligence flow, aerial reconnaissance, decrypted signals, radar tracking, and weather forecasting. The Japanese command, still bound by rigid traditions and secrecy, often made decisions based on honor rather than information. The imperial system resisted innovation when innovation was most needed. Officers who questioned doctrine risked being seen as disloyal. When engineers proposed adding armor or radios to new fighters, purists objected. A true pilot needs no armor. His best protection is skill. Such pride doomed thousands. The American contrast across the Pacific, American naval aviation had transformed into a scientific enterprise. Admiral Chester Nimitz and Admiral Raymond Spruance treated air power not as art, but as industry. They merged intelligence, radar, logistics, and carrier tactics into one integrated machine. By 1944, the U.S. Navy operated massive, fast carrier task forces, floating cities coordinated through radio networks and supported by radar picket ships. Fighters no longer relied solely on eyesight. Radar controllers guided them to targets long before they were visible. Each carrier carried more aircraft than Japan could now produce in a month. American pilots were young too, but they were trained through a standardized, layered system. Every flight school graduate underwent gunnery practice, simulator time, and instrument flying under supervision. By the time a U.S. Navy pilot reached combat, he had hundreds of flight hours, and his training matched his aircraft's capabilities. The difference showed in battle. Where Japanese pilots relied on instinct, Americans relied on procedure. Consistent, repeatable, reliable. War had become a science, and the U.S. was the laboratory. Technology as doctrine, technological parity had once been Japan's edge. The Zero was revolutionary because it combined long range with nimbleness, ideal for offensive operations across vast oceans. But the war's demands changed. Now defense and survivability mattered more than reach. The U.S. responded with the F-6F Hellcat, a rugged, heavily armed fighter designed not for elegance but dominance. It could dive faster, climb higher, and absorb hits that would turn a Zero into a fireball. Hellcats carried 650 caliber machine guns, radio links to carriers, and self-sealing fuel tanks. They were easy to fly, maintain, and mass-produce. The Japanese, starved of aluminum and rubber, could not afford armor or redundancy. Their production methods remained artisanal, skilled but slow. The Americans had moved to assembly line efficiency. Every rivet, every cockpit dial was standardized. By 1944, Japan was flying into the modern age with weapons from the past. The intelligence gap. The Americans knew more about Japan's air power than Japan knew about theirs. Since 1942, U.S. codebreakers had been reading portions of Japan's naval communications, providing detailed knowledge of fleet movements and pilot losses. Before the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Americans knew roughly how many aircraft Japan could deploy, and how inexperienced most of their pilots were. The Japanese, by contrast, still imagined American forces as similar to those of 1942, perhaps slightly improved, but not fundamentally changed. They underestimated U.S. radar coordination, fleet logistics, and pilot training. Tokyo's war planners believed their new aircraft models, the A6M50 and D4Y Suisei dive bomber, could match anything the enemy had. They were wrong. The Americans not only had superior planes, they had systems that magnified every advantage tenfold. The crisis of replacement. By the start of 1944, Japan's air academies were desperate. Once selective schools that admitted a few dozen elite cadets per year were now pushing through thousands. Training times dropped from 2 years to 6 months. In some cases, young men were sent to combat after only 60 hours of flight experience, barely enough to master takeoffs and landings. The results were catastrophic. Accident rates in training soared. Maintenance crews were inexperienced, and many planes went into battle with untested engines. The gap between the old guard, the aces of China and Coral Sea, and the new recruits widened until it became fatal. One surviving Japanese instructor recalled, "By 1944, our students were no longer pilots. They were passengers holding the controls." American training fields, meanwhile, hummed day and night. Every graduate was supported by a pipeline of spare parts, fuel, and replacement planes. The U.S. could afford to lose men and machines. Japan could not afford to lose either. A sky without eyes. Perhaps the most symbolic gap lay in technology Japan had neglected: radar. By 1944, every American task force carried dozens of radar units, shipborne sets that could detect approaching aircraft hundreds of miles away, and fighter direction radars that guided Hellcats to intercept enemies with mathematical precision. U.S. pilots often engaged Japanese formations before the Japanese even knew they'd been detected. Japan had radar prototypes, but limited industrial base and bureaucratic infighting slowed production. Many Japanese commanders distrusted the technology, believing visual observation was more honorable. As a result, they entered the largest air battle of the Pacific nearly blind. The Americans, by contrast, saw everything. Operation Ago, the last gamble in spring 1944. The Imperial Navy drew up Operation Ago, the plan for a decisive carrier battle near the Marianas. The goal: to lure the advancing U.S. fleet into range of land-based Japanese aircraft from Guam, Tinian, and Saipan, then destroy them with combined carrier and island strikes. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the mobile fleet, hoped to recreate the miracle of early war victories. He had 9 carriers, over 400 aircraft, and the belief that one sharp blow could still change the war. But unknown to him, the Americans had already cracked his operations communications and were fully prepared. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, under Admiral Spruance and Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, sailed west with 15 carriers, 7 battleships, and more than 900 aircraft. The numerical odds alone were devastating, but technology and coordination widened the gap further. On paper, both sides seemed powerful. In reality, one side had airmen, the other had an air force. The calm before the storm. As the Japanese fleet approached the Marianas in mid-June 1944, their pilots were eager, even confident. They had been told the Americans were weary, their ships damaged, their airmen untested in long-range combat. Some had trained on wooden mock-ups of enemy planes, repeating rehearsed maneuvers and chants of victory. On American decks, the mood was calm, methodical. Pilots ate quietly, checked instruments, and listened to their flight directors over radio. To them, this was not a desperate gamble. It was another operation, one they had trained for hundreds of times in simulation. Both fleets sighted each other on June 19, 1944. It was morning in the western Pacific. The sea was flat, the air clear, the horizon limitless. Japanese observers reported enemy carriers 300 miles east. Ozawa gave the order: launch all planes. Hundreds of Zero fighters and bombers roared into the sky, the largest airstrike Japan had mounted since Midway. They flew east toward what they believed would be glory. But beyond that horizon lay something no Japanese pilot could see: an invisible web of radar signals, intercept paths, and disciplined formations waiting for them. The decisive battle of the Pacific skies was about to begin, and though Japan did not yet know it, its outcome would mark the end of an era. The human angle, the pilots who carried an empire. For Japan's wartime generation, aviation was sacred. To fly was to serve the emperor himself, to rise beyond the earth in purity and sacrifice. Pilots were national heroes, often drawn from middle-class families who viewed service in the Navy as the highest calling. They were trained not only in flight but in ritual, bowing before the flag, reciting the emperor's rescript, practicing sword etiquette before every mission. The early war pilots, men like Saburo Sakai, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, and Junichi Sasai, embodied that myth. They fought with ferocity and precision, scoring dozens of kills over China and the Pacific. To their comrades, they were legends. To their superiors, they were proof that Japan's spirit could triumph over material odds. But as the war lengthened, that spirit became a burden. By 1943, Japan's training system could no longer produce seasoned aviators. The veterans who had carried the early campaigns were either dead or too few to teach the new wave of recruits. Training airfields lacked fuel, aircraft, and instructors. Many new pilots learned only basic takeoffs and gunnery before being sent into combat. What once took years of mastery now took months of desperation. The result was tragic. Pilots entered battle filled with patriotism but lacking experience, facing American aviators who had practiced dogfighting in controlled conditions, drilled in teamwork and relied on technology to multiply their effectiveness. Some Japanese instructors recognized the futility. They watched young men barely trained depart for combat knowing they would never return, but orders were absolute. To question the mission was unthinkable. Japan's system demanded obedience over survival. By 1944, the Japanese cockpit had become a symbol of national sacrifice, not a weapon of strategic control. Courage was abundant, experience was gone. The tactical angle, how the skies were fought. The difference in tactics between Japan and the United States reflected deeper contrasts in culture and doctrine. At the start of the war, Japan's air tactics emphasized the individual duel. Pilots sought to outmaneuver their opponent through agility and instinct. The thatch weave and other American team maneuvers had not yet become standard. The Zero's turning ability gave Japan an advantage in one-on-one combat, where its light frame could circle tighter and faster than any U.S. fighter. But by 1943, American pilots had rewritten the rulebook. Experience over Guadalcanal and New Guinea taught them to never engage in a turning fight. Instead, they used boom and zoom tactics, diving attacks from altitude using superior speed to strike, then climbing back to safety. Two-plane formations coordinated attacks through radio, protecting each other from ambush. It was combat by calculation rather than intuition. The Japanese continued to rely on older methods, loose formations, visual spotting, and the element of surprise. Yet as radar and radio transformed aerial warfare, those tactics became obsolete. Surprise was no longer possible when American radar could detect an approaching wave 150 miles away. In practice, this meant every Japanese strike was intercepted before it could reach its target. In the Philippine Sea, waves of Zeros and bombers approached in textbook formations, only to be met by hundreds of Hellcats guided into perfect intercept patterns by radar controllers aboard U.S. carriers. The result was systematic annihilation. U.S. pilots reported entire squadrons destroyed in minutes. Japanese attack runs broke apart in confusion, their formations shredded long before they could see their targets. Even within dogfights, the difference was clear. Japanese pilots still aimed by instinct. Americans used reflector gun sights that projected a red aiming dot, allowing precise shooting even in high-speed turns. The average Hellcat pilot fired fewer rounds per kill than any American fighter before it. Technology and discipline had replaced the duelist's art with the scientist's precision. The Japanese still fought with courage, diving into hopeless engagements, trying to protect bombers that never reached their targets. But courage could not change physics. Their lighter planes burned easily, their ammunition was limited, and their coordination fractured the moment the first leader fell. By the time Japanese pilots realized that their opponents were not only better equipped but strategically superior, it was already too late to adapt. The technological angle, the machine race Japan, couldn't win if human will and tactical brilliance once carried Japan. Technology eventually decided the outcome. The Mitsubishi A6M0, Japan's pride, was a masterpiece of pre-war engineering. Weighing less than 5,000 pounds, it could climb higher and turn faster than any fighter in 1941. Its range of 1,500 miles made it ideal for carrier raids across the Pacific. But its designers had built it for offense, not endurance. By 1944, the Zero was an artifact of another era. The Americans now fielded the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, the very symbol of wartime pragmatism. It was not elegant. It was not exotic, but it was deadly reliable. Designed specifically to defeat the Zero, it used a massive 2,000 horsepower engine that gave it unmatched speed and climb. Armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks allowed it to survive hits that would disintegrate a Zero instantly. Even the Zero's guns lagged behind. Most carried two 7.7 machine guns and two 20mm cannons, light, firepower compared to the Hellcats, 650 caliber guns that could rip through aluminum, airframes in seconds. The Americans also mastered maintenance. Hellcats could be repaired in hours. Zeros often remained grounded for days due to lack of spare parts or qualified mechanics. The U.S. had standardized interchangeable components. Japan had not. Then came radar, the unseen revolution. American carriers, cruisers, and destroyers were equipped with radar arrays that provided real-time direction to pilots in combat. Ground controllers aboard ships like the USS Enterprise or USS Lexington could vector fighters to intercept incoming raids with pinpoint accuracy. For Japan, this was sorcery. Their pilots relied on sight and radio reports, often conflicting, often delayed. Once airborne, Japanese formations operated in isolation. If they lost their leader or became separated by clouds, they had no guidance back to their carriers. Many vanished into the ocean, never to be found. Technology was not only in the cockpit, it was in the network. U.S. logistics ships produced fresh aviation fuel, replacement parts, and even replacement planes at sea. Japanese task forces, by contrast, had to retreat hundreds of miles for resupply. Every loss reduced operational capacity permanently. When the two systems finally collided over the Philippine Sea, these invisible differences manifested in brutal clarity. For every Japanese pilot who took off, an American pilot was backed by radar, fuel, spare aircraft, and a disciplined doctrine. It was not a contest of courage but of systems. And systems, unlike men, do not tire. The moment of realization. For those who survived the June 1944 battle, the truth was undeniable. A veteran Japanese ace, after witnessing wave after wave of new recruits shot down, reportedly said, "We no longer fight men. We fight machines." He wasn't speaking metaphorically. The Americans had turned the air war into an industrial process, every engagement calculated, every pilot supported by unseen layers of data and production. In contrast, Japan's airmen still carried the weight of personal honor. They entered combat as warriors, but the battlefield they faced belonged to engineers. And in that mismatch, the future of the Pacific was decided before a single bomb hit its target. The technological divide, Hellcat versus Zero. By mid-1944, Japan's fabled Mitsubishi A6M0 was no longer the terror it once was. When it first appeared in 1940, the Zero stunned every Western pilot who faced it, faster, lighter, and more maneuverable than anything the Allies had. It had unmatched agility, a turning radius that could outcircle any opponent, and pilots who had mastered its dance. But by the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, that same aircraft was a relic of an earlier war. Japan's engineers, hampered by shortages of aluminum, oil, and industrial capacity, couldn't produce an effective successor. The Zero's lightweight frame, once its advantage, became its curse. It couldn't carry armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, or heavy firepower without crippling its performance. In a war now ruled by speed, climb rate, and survivability, that was fatal. The U.S. Navy's F-6F Hellcat, born from lessons learned against the Zero, was a machine of pure, calculated balance. It climbed faster, dove harder, and could absorb punishment that would shred a Zero to ribbons. It wasn't graceful. It was unstoppable. Backed by advanced radar control and immense logistical support, Hellcat pilots often began their attacks from superior altitude and positioning, the very things Japanese pilots once relied on. When the two planes met in 1944, the statistics were merciless. The Hellcat achieved a kill ratio of nearly 19-1 against the Zero. The Japanese pilots didn't lose because they were less brave. They lost because the air itself, the domain they once ruled, had been reshaped by science, steel, and industry. And in that industrial war of attrition, Japan was already doomed. Leadership and doctrine, Yamamoto's legacy. Fades, the ghosts of earlier victories, haunted Japan's air leadership. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, had once believed in the swift, decisive strike, a knockout blow that could shock America into peace. His vision had worked in 1941, but by 1943, the world he imagined no longer existed. Yamamoto was dead, killed when U.S. cryptographers tracked and shot down his transport, but his doctrine still lingered like shadows. Japan's air strategy remained rooted in individual brilliance and heroic offense. Pilots were taught to fight as lone warriors, each a self-contained instrument of precision and sacrifice. The Americans, in contrast, evolved toward cooperation and control, combat information centers, radar coordination, and group tactics that multiplied efficiency. Every U.S. formation functioned as a single organism, flexible, data-driven, and relentless. While the Imperial Navy still romanticized dogfighting, the Americans were redefining it. Victory was no longer about outturning an enemy. It was about finding, tracking, and overwhelming him before he even knew he was seen. The cultural pride that had once fueled Japanese excellence now blinded its command structure to change. By the time Japan realized it needed radar networks and coordinated defense, its infrastructure was already burning under American bombs. Leadership had shifted from daring to discipline, and discipline won. The human factor, courage meets reality. No. Technology or strategy can erase the human spirit that fought in those skies. Japanese pilots of 1944 flew with a courage born of fatalism. Many were told they were the empire's last shield, that if they failed, Japan itself would fall. But their courage collided with cold arithmetic. The average Japanese naval aviator in 1944 had less than 300 hours of total flight time. Many of their American counterparts exceeded 600, with rigorous gunnery and formation training. Where Japan's schools had once produced elite flyers through years of preparation, now the program was shortened to mere months. Planes rolled off assembly lines faster than men could master them. Pilots took off knowing their chances of survival were near zero. The Imperial Navy could no longer recover its losses. Each experienced pilot shot down represented a year of training gone forever. The U.S., by contrast, had built a system that could train thousands and replace every fallen pilot within weeks. Courage without capability became tragedy. The men who rose into the clouds that summer day weren't fools or zealots. They were the inheritors of a dying system, loyal to an ideal that had no answer for radar-guided intercepts, Hellcat squadrons, and the infinite reach of American production. When the battle ended, many Japanese survivors spoke of the same haunting realization. They had not fought men that day. They had fought an empire made of machines, steel, and endless sky. The invisible weapon. Information and coordination. The most decisive weapon of the battle wasn't a fighter or a bomb. It was information. From the decks of Task Force 58, Admiral Mark Mitcher's air staff orchestrated the engagement through radar screens, radio networks, and disciplined timing. Every American pilot knew his position, target, and fallback point. Japanese pilots, on the other hand, often launched without precise intelligence, flying blind over hundreds of miles of ocean in search of enemy fleets that moved faster than they could track American. Radar picked up the first Japanese raids more than 100 miles away. By the time Japanese formations appeared on the horizon, waves of Hellcats were already climbing to intercept. The eyes of the fleet were no longer human lookouts on the mast. They were electronic, invisible, and tireless. Japan's carriers had no such advantage. They relied on scouts, visual sighting, and chance. The result was catastrophic asymmetry. One side fought by sight, the other by signal. That unseen battlefield, radar pulses bouncing off clouds, was where the war's future had already been decided. The pilots might have been the visible symbols of courage, but behind them, an empire of engineers and operators had already won the true contest, mastery of the unseen. By the end of 1944, the truth had become undeniable. Japan's air power wasn't merely losing, it was collapsing under the weight of modernization. In the skies above the Marianas, technology, tactics, and time had all converged against them. And as the next great battle approached, the imbalance would no longer just be tactical, it would become existential. The storm that began over the Philippines Sea would soon spread to Japan's doorstep, June 19, 1944, or wait 30 hours. The Philippine Sea stretched endlessly beneath a blinding sun. On the horizon, the American carrier task force steamed westward in a perfect arc. 15 carriers, escorted by more than 7 battleships, dozens of cruisers, and a wall of destroyers. Each ship bristled with radar masts, antennas, and anti-aircraft guns that glinted like teeth in the light. From the air, the formation looked like a moving fortress, methodical, symmetrical, untouchable. Far to the west, the Imperial Japanese Navy's first mobile fleet had already committed to its desperate gamble. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding from the carrier Taiho, believed he could catch the Americans by surprise. His fleet was massive on paper: 9 carriers, 473 aircraft, and more than 30,000 men. But many of those men were novices, and their aircraft were pale shadows of their former glory. At 8:30, Japanese reconnaissance finally spotted what they believed to be the main American force. Within minutes, Ozawa ordered the first wave aloft: 69 fighters, 45 dive bombers, and 43 torpedo planes. It was a courageous but doomed launch. Even before the first formations cleared the fleet, American radar operators had detected the movement more than 150 miles away. On board the USS Lexington, radar officers calmly tracked the blips. Contact bearing 280, distance 150 miles. It was all they needed. The call went out to Admiral Mark Mitcher: enemy raid inbound. Within moments, the order echoed through every deck: fighter direction, vector to intercept. Engines roared alive. The flight decks thundered under the weight of propellers and wind. Hellcats began to roll, their wings unfolding like mechanical predators awakening. At 10 GM, the first American interceptors found their prey. The sky becomes a killing ground. The Japanese formation, stretched and disorganized, had no warning. Out of the sun came the first swarm of F-6F Hellcats, blue-gray shapes diving at over 400 miles per hour. The first Zero disintegrated under a burst of .50 caliber fire before its pilot even saw the enemy. A second flamed out moments later. In minutes, the sky became chaos, a swirling storm of tracer lines, smoke, and falling debris. American pilots later said it was like shooting fish in a barrel. But in truth, it was a cold, disciplined hunt, guided by radar, coordinated through radio, each formation attacking with clockwork precision. For every American loss, 10 Japanese planes fell from the sky. Many of the Japanese bombers never reached their targets. Those that did were met by a wall of anti-aircraft, fire so dense it looked like a black curtain, rising from the ocean. The first Japanese attack wave lost 70% of its aircraft before even sighting the U.S. fleet. Yet still, Ozawa ordered another wave. At 11:30, the second Japanese strike group, 128 aircraft, launched from Zuikaku and Shokaku, Japan's surviving veterans of Pearl Harbor. The irony was brutal. The same carriers that had once struck fear into America now sent their last strength into an enemy they no longer understood. Radar picked them up instantly. Fighters from USS Essex and USS Yorktown intercepted the group 50 miles out. The result was slaughter. American pilots described it as an aerial massacre. One Hellcat ace, Lieutenant Alexander Vrechu, downed 6 dive bombers in 8 minutes without taking a single hit. By noon, the sea below was littered with burning wreckage. Japanese aircraft ditched into the water, pilots bailing out only to vanish beneath the waves. Radio chatter from Ozawa's fleet grew desperate, broken messages, coordinates, and pleas for direction. Many squadrons never even found their carriers again. The moment of realization. On board the carrier Taiho, Admiral Ozawa stood silently by the chart table, listening to the fragmented reports. The numbers made no sense. Entire squadrons gone silent, coordinates lost, pilots missing. The great fleet he had been promised, the rebuilt air arm of the empire, was vanishing before his eyes. For the Japanese pilots who survived, the horror was immediate and personal. Lieutenant Keiichi Arima, one of the few to return from the first wave, later recalled the moment he realized something fundamental had changed. We could no longer find them first. They always saw us before we saw them. It was as if the Americans could see through the clouds. That was the power of radar, the invisible weapon that stripped the Zero of its greatest advantage: surprise. By early afternoon, the third Japanese strike group took off, this time composed mostly of inexperienced pilots. Many had never flown combat before. They relied on outdated maps and faulty coordinates. When they reached what they believed to be the American fleet, the sea was empty. Confused, they circled, wasting fuel, until radar-guided Hellcats fell upon them. Nearly all were destroyed before they fired a single shot. The destruction of Taiho and Shokaku, even as his air wings disintegrated, Ozawa's nightmare deepened at sea. At 14:30, an American submarine, USS Albacore, slipped through the Japanese screen and fired a spread of torpedoes. One struck the Taiho, the pride of Japan's carrier fleet. The explosion ruptured fuel lines, filling the hangar decks with gasoline vapors. Poor damage control, another symptom of inexperience, turned the ship into a time bomb. Hours later, a single spark triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. The Taiho erupted in a towering fireball, killing hundreds of men, including much of Ozawa's staff. Minutes later, another U.S. submarine, USS Kavala, found the carrier Shokaku and hit her with 3 torpedoes. Within minutes, she too was ablaze and sinking. The sea that had once carried Japan's pride now swallowed it whole. When evening fell, only a fraction of Japan's air strength remained, less than 100 operational planes across the entire fleet. The Americans, by contrast, had lost fewer than 30 aircraft in combat. A sky without opponents. As darkness came, the surviving Japanese pilots tried to find their carriers in the vast expanse of the Pacific. With no radar, no night landing systems, and failing radios, many circled aimlessly until their fuel ran out. The ocean below glowed with burning oil. One by one, aircraft ditched into the waves, their pilots never found again. From the American decks, lookouts watched the distant glow and listened to the silence on their radios. The once feared Japanese Navy Air Service, the force that had terrified the Pacific in 1941, was gone in a single day. Admiral Mitcher stood on the bridge of USS Lexington, the wind tearing at his coat. When asked what had happened, one of his officers answered simply, "Sir, they came, and we shot them down." It was an understatement of world-changing scale. The air war in the Pacific had just ended, though few realized it yet. As the night sky quieted and the horizon burned red with oil fires, a single truth hung heavy over the waves. Japan had lost not just a battle, it had lost the very skies themselves, but the Americans were not finished. The next morning, Mitcher would unleash a counterattack that would erase the last illusion of Japanese air power. June 20th, 1944, dawn over the Philippine Sea. The ocean was quiet, but the stillness was deceptive. Beneath the calm lay the wreckage of Japan's air arm. Hundreds of planes resting on the seafloor, their pilots gone, their carriers limping westward under black columns of smoke. Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 had endured wave after wave of attacks the day before, yet his ships remained nearly unscathed. For every bomb that struck near an American hull, dozens of Japanese aircraft had been destroyed before they could even reach their targets. But Mitcher knew the fight wasn't over. The enemy fleet still existed, damaged but afloat, somewhere over the western horizon. The Americans hadn't yet delivered the final blow, and as the sun rose over the endless blue, Mitcher faced a decision that would define the battle. Should he risk his own pilots in a long-range strike, far beyond safe return distance, to destroy the remnants of Japan's carrier power? It was a gamble worthy of the stakes. The hunt begins at 08:30 a.m. American reconnaissance planes began fanning out across the sea. Their mission? Find Ozawa's retreating fleet. The Japanese, still believing they had inflicted heavy losses the day before, were pulling back to regroup. Their air decks were nearly empty, the few surviving planes being repaired or rearmed. But the Americans didn't yet know exactly where they were. Hours passed with no sighting. Then at 15:40, a scout from USS Enterprise radioed the message Mitcher had been waiting for. Enemy fleet sighted. 200 miles west, there was no hesitation. Mitcher immediately ordered the launch, despite knowing the attack group would have to fly nearly 400 miles round trip, deep into twilight, with the risk of running out of fuel on the return. The carrier decks came alive once again. Waves of Helldiver dive bombers, Avenger torpedo planes, and Hellcat fighters thundered off the decks. 16 aircraft in total, their propellers slicing the orange evening sky. Each pilot knew the truth. They might not have enough fuel to make it back. The last of Japan's carriers, as the American strike force roared westward. Admiral Ozawa's fleet was in disarray. His flagship Taiho and the veteran carrier Shokaku were already gone. That left Zuikaku, Hio, Junyo, and a handful of smaller carriers. Most of their decks were nearly empty. The first warning came at 18:35. Radar contacts approaching fast. Moments later, the sky erupted. From high altitude, the first wave of helldivers peeled over into vertical dives, their wings shuddering under the stress. The ocean below shimmered with explosions as the bombs hit. Onboard Hio, an American torpedo struck amidships. Flames spread instantly through the hangar deck, igniting fuel lines, triggering secondary blasts. Within minutes, the ship was engulfed in fire. Crewmen leapt overboard as ammunition cooked off in a rolling inferno. Then came the Zukaku, Japan's last surviving carrier from Pearl Harbor. Dive bombers screamed down through the smoke, releasing strings of 1,000-pound bombs that slammed into her flight deck. One bomb penetrated deep into the hangar, setting aircraft ablaze. The ship staggered, trailing thick black smoke, barely able to maintain speed. It was a grim symbol. The same carrier that had launched Japan's first attack against America was now crippled by America's vengeance, far from home under a sunset that burned red across the sea. By 1901, 3 carriers were burning. The Japanese escort ships scattered, their formations collapsing. The once proud First Mobile Fleet was now a broken, smoking ruin. The return, flight into darkness, for the American pilots, victory turned to dread as the sun sank below the horizon. They had flown farther than any previous carrier strike, and now their fuel gauges were nearly empty. They still had to find their way back over 200 miles of open ocean in darkness. Admiral Mitcher faced an impossible choice: maintain blackout discipline to protect the fleet from submarine attack, or break it to save his returning pilots. He didn't hesitate. At 20:45, he gave one of the most dramatic orders of the Pacific War: turn on the lights. One by one, every ship in Task Force 58 illuminated its deck. Searchlights pointed skyward. Signal lamps flashed in the dark. Destroyers fired star shells to light the horizon, creating a glowing path through the blackness. It was a beacon of life in an ocean of death. From the air, pilots described the sight as surreal, an island of light floating on an endless dark sea. One exhausted aviator said later, "It was the most beautiful thing I ever saw. It meant home." Even with the lights, dozens of aircraft ditched or ran out of fuel just short of the carriers. Some pilots crashed into the sea and were rescued by destroyers combing the waves through the night. Others disappeared forever, their names later engraved in memorial walls. Mitcher lost more men to fuel starvation than to enemy fire that day, but his decision had saved hundreds more. It was a moment of quiet heroism rarely recorded in textbooks, a commander defying doctrine to save his own. The end of Japanese naval air power. When dawn came on June 21st, the horizon told the story of a war transformed. Oil slicks stretched for miles. Smoke still rose from burning ships. Japanese destroyers raced west, picking up survivors. Out of the 473 aircraft Japan had launched into the battle, over 400 were gone. Many of the surviving pilots were too inexperienced to even rejoin formation. Entire air groups had ceased to exist. The Imperial Navy's finest. The men who had once struck at Pearl Harbor, the legends of Midway, the pride of Rabolka were gone. The Americans, by contrast, had lost fewer than 130 aircraft total, most to fuel exhaustion, not combat. It was not just a victory, it was annihilation. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would later be remembered by American pilots with dark humor as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But beneath that nickname lay a grim truth. It marked the death of Japanese naval aviation. From this moment onward, Japan would never again challenge the United States for air supremacy. The path to the Philippines, to Iwo Jima, to Okinawa, and finally to Japan itself, now lay open. A silent horizon, in the fading light of June 21st, Admiral Ozawa transmitted his final message to Tokyo. The fleet has fought with all its strength. The air groups are destroyed. It was the simple acknowledgement of total defeat. As the message reached Japan, the Imperial General Staff fell into stunned silence. The Empire's great ocean shield, its Air Armada 1, was gone. And they knew what that meant. The next battles would not be fought in distant seas. They would be fought on Japanese soil. For the young pilots who survived, the realization was crushing. They had witnessed not just a military loss, but the death of an entire era, the collapse of the warrior ideal that had defined their generation. The U.S. had not just won the skies, it had changed what the skies meant. and the Japanese, would soon be forced to confront the final desperate evolution of that realization, when courage itself was turned into a weapon. June 22, 1944, the Philippine Sea. The battle was over. The ocean that had roared with engines and gunfire only days before now lay silent, disturbed only by drifting oil slicks and the faint cries of the dying. Smoke hung low over the water, curling from the distant wrecks of what had once been the mightiest carrier fleet in the Pacific. For Japan, it was more than a military defeat. It was a revelation of helplessness. For the United States, it was proof that industrial might, organization, and adaptation had turned into unstoppable weapons. Admiral Mark Mitcher stood on the bridge of USS Lexington that morning, gazing across a fleet untouched in victory. His ships had endured nearly 400 enemy sorties and emerged without losing a single carrier. It was a triumph so decisive that his officers struggled to comprehend its scale. Intelligence reports confirmed what the pilots already suspected. Japan had lost nearly all its carrier aircraft and most of its trained air crews. The numbers told the story plainly. Aircraft lost. Over 400 Japanese. Fewer than 130 American carriers lost. Taiho, Shokaku, and Hio sunk. Pilots lost. More than 3,000 trained aviators, men who could never be replaced. It was the largest single destruction of Japanese air power in the war, a blow from which the Imperial Navy would never recover. Tokyo's shock when the first telegrams reached Tokyo. Disbelief turned to dread. In the underground war rooms of the Naval General Staff, officers gathered around the decoded message from Admiral Ozawa. Its words were brief, almost clinical. The fleet has suffered great losses. Air groups destroyed. Situation critical. Silence followed. No one needed explanation. The decisive battle, the confrontation Yamamoto had envisioned years earlier, had come and gone. And Japan had lost. In the days that followed, the Emperor himself was informed. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of Japan's expansion, had been reduced to a hollow shell. The fleet could still float, but without aircraft. It was blind and powerless. Great ships without eyes or claws. The collapse triggered a cascade of consequences. The Mariana Islands, Japan's forward defense line, were now exposed. The American invasion of Saipan began just as news of the defeat arrived, and for the first time, American bombers now had a base close enough to reach the Japanese mainland itself. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had not just destroyed an air fleet, it had opened Japan's front. For the turning of strategy inside Japan's military command, the aftermath forced painful debate. The Imperial Navy could no longer contest the Pacific in open battle. The once glorious doctrine of the Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle, was dead. Instead, Japanese strategists began to consider something unthinkable, turning human lives into weapons. The first concepts that would later evolve into kamikaze tactics took shape quietly in these very weeks. The reasoning was cruel but logical. If Japan could no longer outproduce, outfly, or outfight the Americans, it might still terrify them through sheer sacrifice. But even this idea, born from desperation, came too late to save the war. The Americans had learned how to break systems, not just armies. They had mastered the methodical destruction of supply, fuel, and infrastructure. Every Japanese carrier sunk meant more than steel lost. It meant the end of a generation of skilled pilots, engineers, and instructors. Japan's strength had always been concentrated in its people, its elite few. America's power lay in its many, and now the many were unstoppable. American reflections for the men of Task Force 58, the victory brought pride, but also exhaustion. Pilots returned to their carriers with thousand-yard stares. Many had seen the enemy only for seconds before destroying him. There was no duel, no dance, only overwhelming advantage. T. Alex Vrasiu, the ace who had downed 6 Japanese planes in one engagement, later reflected with quiet honesty. It wasn't a fight anymore. It was a hunt. We'd won the war in the air right there. In the ready rooms, there was no cheering. The mood was subdued and almost somber. These were professional men who understood what they had done. They respected their enemy's courage, even as they recognized that the battle had turned into something lopsided, almost merciless. The mechanics and deck crews, however, felt the victory in simpler terms. They had watched their friends return alive, their ships unscarred. They had proven that the U.S. Navy's system of logistics, coordination, and training could withstand and dominate anything the enemy could throw. Across the Pacific, radios crackled with the same coded message. The Japanese fleet has been beaten decisively. The Marianas are secure. It meant one thing to the Americans. The road to Tokyo was now open. The broader ripple, strategic collapse. The loss of air cover over the Marianas had immediate consequences. Within weeks, U.S. forces captured Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands became the staging grounds for the next phase, the bombing of Japan's home islands. From airfields on Tinian, the new Boeing B-29 Superfortress could reach Tokyo directly, something that had been impossible before. It was a geographic revolution in warfare. The skies once ruled by Zeros would now be crossed by American bombers carrying fire and destruction to Japan's cities. The fall of Saipan sent political shockwaves through Tokyo. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the face of Japan's wartime leadership, resigned in disgrace. The illusion of victory, sustained through propaganda and faith, finally shattered. For the first time, Japanese civilians began to understand that the war might be lost, and all of it had begun with the destruction of Japan's air wings in the Philippine Sea. A broken generation, in the weeks after the battle, Japanese survivors drifted across the Pacific in life rafts. Some were rescued by destroyers, others never found. Those who did return to Japan were shadows of the men who had left. Exhausted, guilt-ridden, and haunted, they spoke of a battle they could never win, of radar-guided enemies who seemed to strike from nowhere. The Navy tried to hide the scale of the disaster, but word spread among air bases and training schools. Morale plummeted. Young cadets began to realize they were being sent into a war that could no longer be won. Yet still they trained, driven by duty and pride, the last remnants of a belief that discipline could overcome destiny. American analysts, studying the wreckage of downed Zeros and captured reports, marveled at the bravery of Japan's pilots. But they also saw the truth. Bravery without industry was suicide. The skies of 1944 no longer belonged to the hero. They belonged to the system, to radar, logistics, mass production, and control. And that system had now crushed everything the old world stood for. As the survivors of the Great Marianas battle sailed west toward Okinawa, the Empire's Navy faced an unthinkable truth. It could no longer defend its islands. For the first time in the war, Japan's commanders began to prepare for invasion. And as the Americans advanced from island to island, Japan's last weapon, born from defeat and despair, began to take shape. Tokyo, July 1944. The air inside the Navy Ministry was heavy with silence. Officers stood around a large operations map, staring at the expanding red arrows that now stretched from the Marianas toward the Japanese mainland. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had redrawn the entire Pacific, not just in lines of territory, but in lines of hope. Japan's proud carrier fleet, once the spearhead of its empire, was now a broken relic. The remaining ships, Zuikaku, Junyo, and Chitose, could still sail, but they had no pilots to fill their decks, no aircraft to launch. Their flight crews had been consumed in the sky above the Philippine Sea. Lost in a single terrible gamble, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's final report summed up the tragedy in one line. The fleet fought with honor, but our wings were destroyed. No one in Tokyo could dispute it. The Imperial Navy had ceased to exist as an offensive force. The psychological collapse. The loss of the carriers was more than just a tactical defeat. It struck at Japan's very identity. Since 1905, the Navy had been the symbol of Japan's rise to power, the force that defeated Russia, the pride of the emperor. Now its humiliation was total. In newspapers, the government tried to hide the scale of the defeat, calling it a setback during operations near the Marianas. But within the armed forces, everyone knew. Naval officers avoided the subject entirely in conversation. Air cadets whispered about the great loss. For Japan's young pilots, the battle became a dark legend, the day when skill, courage, and training meant nothing against American machines. They began to ask a question that had no easy answer. If even our best men could not win, what is left for us to do? That question would soon define Japan's final year of war. Birth of a desperate idea in August 1944, meetings were held at the Naval Air Bureau to discuss the future of Japan's defense. The conclusions were grim. Aircraft production was collapsing due to bombings and fuel shortages. The new pilots being trained were inexperienced, barely able to fly in formation. Radar and coordination lagged hopelessly behind American systems. During one of these sessions, a young officer, Captain Motoharu Okamura, made a radical suggestion. He proposed using pilots themselves as the weapon, crashing their planes directly into American ships. At first, his superiors dismissed it as madness. But the numbers left no alternatives. Japan could not build new carriers, nor could it replace lost crews. The empire's only remaining resource was human willpower. Okamura said quietly, almost to himself, "In my opinion, there is only one way left, and to die beautifully for the emperor." And so, the seed of kamikaze warfare was planted, born directly from the ashes of the Philippine Sea. America advances. While Japan wrestled with despair, the United States wasted no time. The victory had cleared the path to the Philippines and beyond. Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur prepared for their next coordinated strike, the return to the Philippines. The U.S. fleet now moved with absolute confidence. Task Force 58 had proven invincible. The Navy's logistical system, floating dry docks, fuel tankers, ammunition barges, allowed operations anywhere, anytime. The Big Blue Fleet, as sailors proudly called it, had become an empire of motion. On deck, new aircraft lined up under the Pacific sun. The F-6F Hellcat, now fully dominant, the SB-2C Helldiver, perfected for carrier strikes. The TBM Avenger, hunting submarines and surface ships alike. Every month, hundreds more rolled off American assembly lines, a rate Japan could never match. In the air and on the sea, America's superiority was no longer a matter of tactics. It was industrial destiny, a war of attrition Japan couldn't win by. Late 1944, Japan was losing aircraft faster than it could build them. The once powerful Mitsubishi and Nakajima factories were now targets themselves, flattened by high-altitude raids from B-29s flying out of Saipan and Tinian. Fuel reserves dropped to critical levels. Every flight became a calculation. Was the mission worth the fuel it would burn? Pilots were told to conserve every drop, to taxi with engines off, to train without live ammunition. It was a slow death, a military force starving while still standing. Meanwhile, American pilots flew missions with full tanks, fresh engines, and endless replacements. They rotated home after a set number of missions. Japanese pilots fought until death or exhaustion. The difference was no longer courage, it was survival. The emotional weight among Japanese officers, the mood turned fatalistic. Letters from airmen to their families began to take on a haunting tone. If I do not return, know that I gave my life for Japan. May our sacrifice awaken the spirit of our people. These were not the words of men eager for death. They were words of acceptance. They had seen the skies change. They had seen the Zero, once the symbol of victory, fall before radar-guided guns and swarms of Hellcats. In the officers' mess, veterans of Midway and Coral Sea spoke quietly of the new reality. We trained for honor, one said, but we are fighting machines now. Machines never tire, machines never fear. They knew it was over. The only question left was how Japan would face its ending, through surrender, or through sacrifice, a fleet without wings back at sea. The remains of the once mighty Imperial Navy regrouped in Japan's home waters. The carriers floated eerily quiet, their flight decks empty. Without planes, they became little more than decoys, giant metal shells drifting in formation. Admiral Ozawa, now disillusioned, wrote in his diary, "I command ghosts. Ships without air, hearts without hope." He knew what was coming next. When the Americans invaded the Philippines that October, Ozawa's carriers would be used not to fight, but to lure the U.S. fleet away from Leyte Gulf. They would sail as bait, knowingly sent to die. The Philippine Sea had not only broken Japan's air power, it had rewritten its entire naval strategy into one of sacrifice. A nation in denial, Despite the scale of the loss, Japan's propaganda machine continued. The newspaper spoke of heroic resistance. Radio broadcasts promised that the divine wind, the kamikaze, would protect the homeland. But ordinary citizens were not fooled. Many began to feel a quiet dread, an unspoken awareness that the war's end was coming, and it would not be glorious. Factories struggled to operate without raw materials. Cities prepared for bombing raids by digging shelters. For the first time, the illusion of invincibility, the spirit of 1941, was gone. The Philippine Sea had stripped Japan not just of ships and planes, but of the belief that it could win. Echoes across the ocean in America. The victory was celebrated, but in measured tones. The Navy released few photographs, few details. The commanders knew the war was not yet over. Ahead lay Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the Japanese mainland itself. Still, historians would later look back and agree. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was the moment Japan's fate was sealed. It was not the bloodiest battle of the war, but it was the most decisive. It erased Japan's ability to project power. It transformed the Pacific from a contested sea into an American highway. And it marked the beginning of the end, the final irreversible descent toward surrender. The sun set over Tokyo Bay that summer in shades of orange and red. Beneath that sky, Japan's admirals stood watching their fleets return, battered, silent, and half-empty. They had built an empire on the sea. Now, the sea was reclaiming it. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was more than just a clash of carriers and planes. It was the passing of an era. In its smoke-filled skies, two worlds collided. One built on tradition and courage, and the other built on technology and mass production. When the clouds cleared, only one remained. For Japan, the loss was not merely military. It was psychological, a shattering of faith. The pilots who once believed in their divine skill discovered that valor alone could not overcome machinery, planning, and resources. They had grown up hearing that Japan's spirit was invincible, yet in June 1944, they saw something new. That discipline and courage meant nothing if the world itself had changed. The old warriors, the generation raised under the samurai ideal, found themselves facing a kind of enemy they had never understood. The Americans did not fight for honor or glory. They fought with mathematics, logistics, and precision, a war fought through factories, fuel lines, and assembly schedules. To the Japanese pilots, this was alien. To the Americans, it was the future. The end of the Zero Age just 3 years earlier. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had been the most feared fighter in the world. Graceful, agile, almost mystical in its dominance. It embodied Japan's sense of destiny. But by 1944, the same plane was being torn apart by Hellcats, radar control, and trained gunners firing from ships guided by electronic eyes. It wasn't that the Zero had changed. The world had. The era of individual heroism was ending. The age of industrial warfare had taken its place. The Japanese pilots who died over the Philippine Sea weren't weak or unskilled. They were fighting the wrong kind of war in the wrong century. Their courage had outlived the tools of their time. The sound of silence after the battle. The Pacific fell strangely quiet. The once constant reports of Japanese air raids stopped. American sailors spoke of it in hushed tones. How the skies seemed empty now. How carrier decks launched missions without resistance. It was a silence that carried weight. Behind that silence lay the ghosts of Japan's finest. 3,000 airmen lost in 2 days. The ocean had become their grave, and the wind that once carried their engines now whispered through the wreckage below. In that silence, the U.S. Navy prepared for the next stage, knowing that victory in the sky would soon bring horror on the ground. A lesson in power historians often call the Battle of the Philippine Sea the moment America became unstoppable. It was proof that wars are not won only by bravery, but by systems, organization, and endurance. The United States had learned how to turn industry into strategy and efficiency into power. Japan, still fighting with ideals forged in the age of the sword, could not keep pace with a nation that could build a new fleet, faster than its enemy could destroy one. The battle's outcome was not just a reflection of who fought harder, but who adapted faster, the human cost yet. Beneath the numbers and statistics, there was tragedy on both sides. The Japanese pilots, many barely 20 years old, flew knowing their odds of survival were near zero. Some had trained for only 100 flight hours before being sent into combat against veterans who had fought since Guadalcanal. They died believing they were defending their homeland, unaware that their sacrifice had already been rendered meaningless by the scale of American dominance. Even for the victors, the battle left an unease. U.S. sailors cheered their success, but some could not forget the sight of burning planes spiraling into the sea, men who never had a chance to fight back. War had turned into something mechanized, detached, and almost inhuman. A world transformed by the war's end in 1945, Japan lay in ruins. The carriers that survived the Philippine Sea were sunk or scrapped. The skies once ruled by the rising sun now belonged to jet aircraft and radar, the dawn of a new age. And yet, in a strange way, the courage of those Japanese pilots endured. Their struggle, hopeless though it was, symbolized a final act of faith in a vanishing world, a belief that human will could still stand against metal and machinery. It couldn't, but it left a memory, one that still stirs respect, even among those who defeated them. Epilogue on calm days in the Marianas. Divers still find fragments of Zero fighters resting on the ocean floor, wings corroded, canopies shattered, fuselages wrapped in coral. They are quiet reminders of a time when the sky itself seemed to burn. The sea has claimed them now as it does all things. But if you listen closely, in that stillness, in that endless blue, you can almost hear what they must have felt in those final seconds. The sudden, awful realization that the war was already lost, and that the future had arrived, in the roar of the American engines above.